All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to see exactly how post-World War II America took a giant pile of cash and transformed it into literally the most successful macroeconomic weapon in history. We usually think of war and peace in terms of troops, tanks, treaties, all that stuff. But today, we are looking at a completely different kind of arsenal. Picture this. It's 1945. The absolute most destructive war in human history has finally come to an end. But for the average person over in Europe, that celebration, yeah, it was incredibly short-lived. Because instead of, cheering in the streets, you've got starving people standing in the rubble of destroyed infrastructure, completely leveled factories. They were living in what was essentially a graveyard of broken nations. So, you look at this nightmare scenario, and you really have to ask, how on earth do you fix a broken continent? You've got entire populations starving, desperately trying to figure out which of these new emerging superpowers is going to run their lives. And right in the middle of this, the United States faced a massive, totally unprecedented geopolitical challenge. And that brings us to a core concept for today, the macroeconomic weapon. Think of it as a strategic financial initiative. It's specifically designed to integrate economies, prevent future wars, and crucially, stop the spread of rival ideologies. So the really important takeaway here is that the Marshall Plan wasn't just some act of historical charity. No, it was a highly calculated, deliberately designed macroeconomic weapon meant to ensure nobody ever wanted to become a communist. Section 1. The Communist Alternative. Poverty as a Recruiter. Okay, so the U.S. looks at the ruins of late 1940s Europe, specifically split, occupied zones like Germany, and they realize a pretty terrifying truth. Poverty, it is the absolute best recruiter for a revolution. The Cold War stakes were just astronomically high. I mean, think about it. If people in a capitalist system can't even find basic bread to feed their families, well, they're naturally going to start looking for it in a communist system that's actively promising them a brand new utopia. To counter this massive threat, the U.S. adopted a radical new strategy, perfectly summarized by a really powerful idea: justice through prosperity. Because instead of just punishing the losers of the conflict, which, remember, was already happening at the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, the U.S. realized that punishment alone simply wouldn't build a stable future. The new goal was incredibly pragmatic. Actually, it was kind of genius. They wanted to build a tightly interconnected system where everyone was simply too profitable, too comfortable, and entirely too busy making money to even consider starting another conflict. Prosperity essentially became the ultimate pacifier. Section 2. The Three-Stage Weapon. Executing the Marshall Plan. Now, this strategy to completely overhaul the European landscape wasn't just some random, scattered handout. Not at all. It was rolled out in three very distinct, highly strategic stages: economic transplant, geopolitical shield, and systemic integration. So, Stage 1, economic transplant. At first, the United States didn't just send emergency food rations to, hold people over. Instead, they deliberately sent heavy machinery and raw materials. The explicit goal here was to get those European factories running independently again, so they could actually produce their own goods. And the underlying logic here is just brilliant. The ultimate goal was to create an interconnected global trade network, rip down those restrictive trade barriers, and essentially force nations to buy and sell from their neighbors. And the psychological trick? Well, it is vastly harder to invade your neighbor when they're also your biggest customer. Right. Moving on to Stage 2, the geopolitical shield. By heavily propping up these Western European economies with massive cash injections and resources, the U.S. was quite literally utilizing this money as a giant continental shield against Soviet influence. And this economic contrast, it became a massive propaganda win. On one hand, you had the thriving capitalist West experiencing these huge recoveries, contrasted directly with the Soviet East. The Soviet system, as you know, was this really rigid, command bureaucratic system that frequently just disregarded actual economic realities. So, because of the Marshall Plan, the West was suddenly experiencing what we now call economic miracles, literally right next door to all these Soviet struggles. Finally, we reach Stage 3, systemic integration. This stage actively encouraged European nations to stop acting like bitter historical rivals and finally start acting like a unified economic team. This teamwork dynamic is absolutely fascinating, mostly because it became the actual template for the early European Union. A prime example of this was the really aggressive push by the US for West Germany to be unified and rebuilt. Now, as you can imagine, this absolutely terrified French and British leaders. The irony here is staggering. The US essentially had to force the victims of World War II to team up with their former aggressors just to survive. But, the brutal calculus from the US was incredibly clear. A strong, rich Germany served as a vastly better barrier against the Soviet heartland than a weak, starving one. Real security actually required a prosperous former enemy. Section 3. The Economic Miracle. The results of the plan. So, what actually happened when this macroeconomic weapon was fully deployed? The results were absolutely staggering. Western Europe began seeing economic growth rates that were literally double what they had been before the war. I mean, they were setting the modern standard for rapid, exponential economic recovery. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was forced to heavily drain its own resources just trying to keep its struggling client states afloat. This desperate attempt to keep up sparked severe economic stagnation, and that stagnation ultimately became the very rot that caused the Soviet collapse decades later. The Marshall Plan ultimately proved a completely new paradigm in modern history. It showed us that a thriving, interconnected economy is a far better geopolitical deterrent than a million soldiers. You simply don't need a massive standing army if everyone's wealth is completely tied together. It successfully turned a region that had spent centuries as a perpetual war zone, literally blowing itself up over and over again, into a stable, interconnected powerhouse. It built this peaceful paradise of trade that fundamentally changed the global economic landscape forever. But hey, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. Looking back at the immense geopolitical gains the United States secured against the Soviets, was the Marshall Plan truly a selfless act of historical charity meant to save a dying continent? Or was it simply a brilliant, highly calculated way for the US to buy an entire continent of loyal allies? Think about that. And as always, keep questioning the mechanics of history.